So we've been exploring the world of symbols
Yeah.
and how they impact social movements.
Right.
And you specifically wanted to get into sociologist S.Tarrow's take on all this.
Hmm.
His book, Power in Movement, really dives into how movements use symbols,
Mhm.
symbolic language and actions,
Yeah.
not just to reflect culture, but to actually create meaning
Yeah.
and build support.
That's right.
So in this deep dive, we're going to uncover the ways movements use symbols strategically to
Mhm.
get their messages across,
Right.
achieve their goals, even when they're up against powerful opponents and tricky media dynamics.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
What's really interesting about Tarrow's work is that he doesn't just look at how movements use existing symbols,
Oh, okay.
like a national flag or a particular color,
Right, right.
but he digs deeper into how they actively shape and create entirely new symbols to get their message across. It's about crafting a sort of visual and emotional language that people can connect with.
So they're not just borrowing symbols, they're actually creating a whole new vocabulary for their movement.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Tarrow argues that movements are engaged in a constant battle for meaning.
Okay.
They need to frame their grievances, their goals, their very identity in a way that motivates people to get involved.
I can see how that would be crucial, especially when you think about how much information we're bombarded with every day.
Oh, yeah.
A movement really needs to cut through the noise.
Absolutely. And to illustrate this point, Tarrow brings up a rather absurd anecdote from the French Revolution.
Okay.
Apparently, during the Revolution, the government had something like a fashion police that dictated what people could and couldn't wear to show their allegiance.
A fashion police during a
Yeah,
revolution.
sounds almost comical, doesn't it?
I can't even imagine.
It might seem strange, but it actually highlights a crucial point. Symbols can be used for both rebellion and control.
Okay.
Think of it this way. On the one hand, you have revolutionaries using clothing as a symbol of their defiance against the old regime. On the other hand, you have the government trying to co-opt those symbols and use them to enforce their own agenda.
That's a really interesting point.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder about how movements navigate that tension between creating their own symbols and having those symbols potentially appropriated by those in power.
Exactly. And this idea of symbols as tools for both control and rebellion is something that we see throughout history.
Okay.
Take Gandhi's use of khadi cloth during India's independence movement, for example.
That was a powerful symbol of self-reliance and resistance to British rule, wasn't it?
Yes. By choosing to wear khadi, which was hand-spun and hand-woven in India, Gandhi was not only promoting local industry, but also making a statement about rejecting British-made goods. It became a symbol of Indian identity and a rejection of colonial rule.
So it wasn't just about the cloth itself, it was about the message it conveyed.
Exactly. And this connects to a broader discussion about political culture,
Okay.
a term that historians and anthropologists have used to understand how revolutions unfold and reshape societies.
So how does political culture relate to symbols?
Well, scholars like George Moss, for example,
Okay.
have argued that political culture is shaped by shared symbols, rituals, and myths.
Okay.
He pointed out that even seemingly simple symbols like clothing choices can become incredibly powerful tools for shaping political identity.
So it's about understanding the cultural context in which these symbols emerge and how they gain meaning within that context.
Exactly. And other historians like Mona Ozouf, Keith Baker, and Lynn Hunt
Okay.
have also emphasized the importance of symbolism and myth-making in shaping nations and driving revolutionary change. Their work helps us see that revolutions aren't just about political and economic shifts, but also about profound cultural transformations.
So it's not just about the symbols themselves, but also about the stories they tell and the emotions they evoke.
Right.
They tap into existing cultural frameworks and sometimes even create entirely new ones.
Right. And that's where the idea of collective action frames, as described by David Snow and his colleagues, becomes really important. Right. Movements use these frames to highlight injustices, pinpoint who's to blame, and offer solutions.
Okay.
They're essentially crafting a narrative that resonates with people and motivates them to join the movement.
It sounds like they're building a case for their cause, using symbols and stories to make their arguments more persuasive. Could you give an example of how this works in practice?
Absolutely. The American Civil Rights Movement is a great example.
Okay.
They strategically framed their demands in terms of rights, a concept that was already deeply embedded in American culture and values.
So they were using a familiar concept, something people could relate to make their case for equality.
Exactly. And by framing their struggle in terms of rights, the civil rights movement was able to connect with a much broader audience,
Okay.
including many white Americans who might not have initially been sympathetic to their cause.
It's fascinating how movements can use existing cultural frameworks to their advantage.
Hmm.
But isn't there a risk of diluting their message or compromising their goals by trying to fit into those frameworks?
That's a great question, and it brings us to another important point, the difference between consensus formation and mobilization.
Okay.
This distinction was made by sociologist Bert Klandermans,
Right?
and it helps to explain how movements build support and translate that support into action.
So what exactly is the difference between consensus formation and mobilization?
Think of consensus formation as a slow, organic process that happens within social networks.
Okay.
People share ideas, discuss their grievances, and gradually come to a shared understanding of their situation.
It's like a groundswell of agreement that builds over time.
Exactly. But that shared understanding doesn't necessarily translate into action.
Right.
That's where mobilization comes in.
Okay.
Mobilization is the deliberate effort to spread the movement's message, recruit supporters, and turn that consensus into a force for change.
So consensus formation is like the simmering pot, and mobilization is what brings it to a boil.
That's a great analogy. And it highlights how movements need to be strategic. They need to understand how to build consensus,
Right.
how to tap into existing cultural frameworks,
Uh-huh.
and how to mobilize people to take action.
And all of this is happening within a very crowded and complex landscape, right?
Yeah.
You've got media messages,
Yeah.
government propaganda, competing movements,
Right.
and deeply ingrained cultural beliefs all vying for attention.
Exactly. To illustrate this, S.Tarrow highlights a really interesting example. Italian communists trying to adapt their message to local Catholic traditions.
Okay.
They attempted to co-opt the festa, a traditional religious festival, to spread their message.
That's a fascinating example. Communists trying to blend into a deeply Catholic culture. It seems counterintuitive, doesn't it?
It does, and it highlights the challenges and dilemmas movements face when trying to connect with people within their cultural context.
Right.
Sometimes trying to blend in works brilliantly, and sometimes it backfires spectacularly.
And of course, we can't forget the media's role in all of this.
Oh yeah, of course.
It's such a powerful force that can either amplify a movement's message or completely distort it.
Absolutely. Media coverage can be a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it can shine a spotlight on a movement's cause and bring it to national attention.
Right.
But on the other hand, it can oversimplify a movement's message, focus on the more sensational aspects, or even frame it in a negative light.
So movements need to be really savvy about how they engage with the media, both to leverage its power and to manage the risks. Did S.Tarrow offer any examples of movements that successfully navigated this challenge?
He did. In fact, his analysis of the civil rights movement is particularly insightful in this regard.
Okay.
He talks about how the movement brilliantly leveraged the existing American cultural framework of rights, but combined it with innovative tactics like nonviolent direct action.
That's a fascinating point.
Yeah.
So they were building on a familiar concept, but they were also doing something completely new and unexpected,
Right.
which probably helped them capture media attention.
Exactly. And this created a powerful new frame for understanding rights in the context of racial equality. It resonated with both Black Americans and white sympathizers, while simultaneously exposing the hypocrisy of a system that claimed to uphold those very rights.
It's a great example of how movements can blend into existing cultural values while simultaneously challenging the status quo.
Precisely. And this idea of blending the familiar with the innovative is also evident in S.Tarrow's analysis of the Polish Solidarity movement.
Ah, yes. Solidarity, that movement combined religious symbolism with a new powerful symbol of worker solidarity, a symbol that emerged organically from the struggle itself.
Exactly. Think about the image of Lech Walesa, a shipyard electrician, standing beside the image of the Pope,
Okay.
both with their hands raised in a gesture of defiance.
That's a powerful image.
Yeah.
It speaks to the movement's ability to tap into both religious and secular values to unite workers and believers under a common cause.
Right, and that's one of S.Tarrow's main points. Movements are constantly interacting with their cultural environment, borrowing, adapting, and creating new symbols and frames to achieve their goals.
Yeah.
It's a dynamic process that involves negotiation, innovation, and often a good deal of risk-taking.
And those symbols can have a profound impact. They can ignite passion, inspire hope, and create a sense of collective identity that transcends individual differences.
Absolutely. And as we delve deeper into your other sources, We'll explore how these symbols play out in different contexts, how they're shaped by media dynamics, and how they ultimately contribute to a movement's success. It's interesting to think about how movements have to adapt their symbolic language to the media landscape.
Yeah.
It's not just about creating powerful symbols.
Right.
It's also about ensuring those symbols are seen and understood
Uh-huh.
in a world overflowing with information.
You've hit on something I've been pondering.
Okay.
Movements seem to be both consumers and producers of cultural symbols.
Right.
They draw on what already exists,
Uh-huh.
but also need to create something fresh and captivating to stand out.
Precisely. S.Tarrow argues that successful movements become incredibly savvy in using media to their advantage.
Okay.
They need to understand how to frame their messages to resonate with journalists and editors,
Okay.
those gatekeepers of information.
So are we saying movements have to become their own PR teams?
In a sense, yes.
Wow.
They need to consider sound bites, visuals, and narratives
Yeah.
that will capture the attention of the media
Okay.
and turn the public.
Yeah.
Strategic game.
But as we discussed earlier, that relationship with the media can be a double-edged sword.
Oh, for sure.
A movement's message can easily get twisted
Uh-huh.
or even hijacked by the media's agenda.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's why movements must be strategic about the types of actions they engage in,
Right.
the symbols they use,
Mm-hmm.
and how they present themselves to the public.
Okay.
They have to be aware of how the media operates
Right.
and how their actions will be perceived.
S.Tarrow's example of the anti-nuclear movement in the 1980s really highlights this, right?
Yeah. He talks about how the media's portrayal of nuclear power shifted over time
Uh-huh.
from a narrative of progress and technological wonder
Right.
to a narrative of risk, disaster, and government accountability.
Yes. And that shift in media framing had a huge impact on the movement's success,
Okay.
as public opinion turned against nuclear power, partly due to coverage of accidents like 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl.
Right.
The movement gained significant momentum.
It's a powerful reminder that while movements can harness the power of media, they can also be vulnerable to its whims and biases.
Exactly. It's a complex relationship, and it leads us to another important aspect.
Okay.
The role of action in shaping symbolic meaning.
Right.
It's not enough to just talk the talk.
Uh.
Movements need to walk the walk.
Okay.
S.Tarrow emphasizes that they create new meaning through their actions,
Right.
not just by reflecting existing cultural symbols.
Can you give us an example of how that plays out in the real world?
Let's go back to the civil rights movement.
The idea of rights was already present in American law and culture.
Right.
But it took the movement's actions,
Mm-hmm.
the sit-ins, the freedom rides, the marches,
Right.
to breathe new life and urgency into those words.
So their actions made rights more than just a legal concept.
Mm-hmm.
They turned them into a tangible lived experience for people.
Precisely. And the media's role in amplifying those actions was crucial.
Okay.
They broadcasted images of peaceful protesters facing brutal violence, forcing the nation to confront the gap between its ideals and its reality.
So we see how the movement's actions combined with the media's coverage created a powerful new frame for understanding rights in the context of racial equality.
Exactly. And S.Tarrow argues that when a movement successfully establishes a new frame, it can become a master frame, a sort of blueprint for other movements to adapt and use in their own struggles.
So the frame of rights that emerged from the civil rights movement has been adopted and adapted by countless other movements, right?
Yes.
From women's rights to LGBTQ plus rights to environmental rights.
You got it. And this illustrates how movements build on each other's successes,
Uh-huh.
creating a ripple effect that can lead to real societal change.
It's inspiring to think about how these symbols and frames born from moments of struggle can leave such a lasting mark on the world.
And to show you just how dynamic this process of symbol creation and adaptation can be,
Okay.
you shared material on the Polish Solidarity movement.
Right.
It's a fascinating case study
Yeah.
in how movements blend existing cultural symbols
Uh-huh.
with new ones that emerge organically from their struggles.
Yes. The Solidarity movement combined the symbolism of Catholicism,
Right.
a powerful force in Polish culture,
Mm-hmm.
with a new symbol of worker solidarity that arose from their collective action.
Right. Think about the Solidarity logo, a stylized figure of workers uniting.
Okay.
It became a powerful symbol of resistance to communist rule,
Right.
one that resonated with millions of Poles.
And it's important to note that this symbol didn't just magically appear. It emerged from the movement itself, from the experiences of workers coming together to demand their rights.
Precisely. This goes back to one of S.Tarrow's central points.
Okay.
The most successful movements are those that can create symbols that resonate with people's lived experiences.
Right.
Symbols that capture the essence of their struggle and their aspirations.
So it's not just about finding the right symbol. It's about creating the conditions for that symbol to emerge and take root in people's hearts and minds.
You nailed it. That's where the interaction between culture, strategy, and action becomes so crucial.
Okay.
Movements need to understand their cultural context, make strategic choices about framing their message,
Right.
and engage in actions that imbue those symbols with meaning and power.
And as we've seen with the civil rights movement and solidarity, when movements get this right, they can achieve truly remarkable things.
You know, while we focus heavily on the civil rights movement and solidarity,
Yeah.
I'm curious to delve a bit deeper into this anti-nuclear movement you mentioned. How did media framing specifically contribute to its success?
Right.
And did it create any lasting symbols that we see even today?
These are great questions. And they lead us to another critical aspect of how movements use symbols to achieve their goals.
Okay.
It's almost like they have a strategic toolkit at their disposal. And understanding that toolkit can help us appreciate just how impactful movements can be.
It feels like we've been building up to this, how movements actually use these symbols strategically to gain support and create change.
Right.
They have a whole arsenal of symbolic tools they can deploy.
Exactly. And one of the most powerful tools, as we've seen in some of these examples, is connecting their message to deeply held cultural values or beliefs.
Right.
It's not just about coming up with something new. It's about taking what's already there and making it relevant to the movement's goals.
You've hit the nail on the head. The civil rights movement is a perfect example. They didn't invent the idea of rights. They drew on a long tradition of American values and legal principles. But as we discussed, it was their actions combined with media coverage that gave those rights new urgency and power in the context of racial equality.
So they were taking a familiar concept and reframing it. Making it impossible to ignore in the face of such blatant injustice.
Precisely. And this reframing often involves highlighting hypocrisy or contradictions within a society's values.
Like in the civil rights movement, exposing the gap between America's ideals of equality and the reality of segregation and discrimination.
Exactly. And this can be incredibly effective at mobilizing support.
Okay.
Especially from those who might not have initially been sympathetic to the movement's cause.
It forces people to confront those uncomfortable truths about their society and see the world through a new lens.
You've got it. Another powerful tool movements use is storytelling.
Okay.
They are essentially in the business of telling stories that help people understand their grievances, pinpoint who is to blame, and offer a vision of change.
And those stories often revolve around individuals or events that become symbolic of the movement's larger struggle, right? Like Rosa Parks refusing to give up her seat on the bus, or the iconic image of Tank Man standing in front of those tanks in Tiananmen Square.
Those are great examples. These stories and images have the power to go beyond language and cultural barriers, to evoke powerful emotions and inspire people to take action.
And of course, the media plays a huge role in spreading those stories far and wide.
Absolutely. Movements are getting more and more adept at using the media to their advantage.
Okay.
They stage events and protests, specifically designed to capture the attention of journalists, and by extension, the wider public.
But as we've talked about, that relationship with the media is always tricky.
Yeah, it is.
Movements have to walk a fine line to make sure their message doesn't get twisted or hijacked by the media's own biases and agendas.
You're absolutely right. It's a constant balancing act between leveraging the media's power and staying in control of your message.
Right.
And it's especially challenging in today's media landscape, which is increasingly fragmented and complex.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the power of symbols, what are the key takeaways you want listeners to walk away with?
I really want them to understand that symbols are not just pretty pictures or catchy slogans.
Right.
They are vital tools for movements to frame their message, build support, and challenge those in power.
They're the very building blocks of collective identity and the language of social change.
That's it. I also want listeners to grasp the dynamic interplay between culture, strategy, and action.
Okay.
When it comes to the meaning and impact of symbols, movements need to be incredibly savvy about understanding their cultural context.
Right.
Making smart choices about how to frame their message, and taking actions that give those symbols real meaning and power.
It's a delicate dance, this constant process of negotiation and adaptation.
Precisely. And lastly, I want listeners to remember that the most successful movements are the ones that create symbols that resonate with people's lived experiences.
Okay.
Symbols that truly capture the essence of their struggles and aspirations.
Yeah.
When movements get that mix right, they can ignite passion, inspire hope, and ultimately change the world.
So as you continue to explore the power of symbols in your own life, think back to these insights.
Mm.
Pay attention to the symbols you encounter. Think critically about how they're being used.
Yeah.
And ask yourself what stories they tell about the world we live in.
Right?
Maybe you'll even feel inspired to create some powerful symbols of your own.
And on that note, we'll leave you with this. What symbols have the power to unite us in the face of all the complex challenges our world is facing today?